Indeed, it's time now to take a look at what's grabbing headlines in the world's press. We're joined by Solange Mujon. Solange, good morning again.
Morning.
The papers in Spain, I imagine, covering that quite unusual speech from the king.
Yeah, let's start by looking at the different front pages of the Spanish papers. Let's start with El País. They've all of the papers have run with the headline of El Rey, or King Felipe VI. El País, the national daily, says the king has called for constitutional order to be returned to Catalonia. Now, ABC, which is a conservative paper, also put the king on the front cover. He's looking very authoritative. Now, El Mundo goes with a slightly more political headline, this time using quotations. It has Felipe saying, quote, "The powers of the state must end the, quote, unacceptable disloyalty of the Catalan regional government." Inside El Mundo, there's an editorial that sings the king's praises. It says his speech was well-timed and necessary, and that the king's choice of not using the word dialogue was a smart one, because, quote, "not all opinions are legitimate and valid." Now, the opinion piece says that the king did a good job of presenting himself as the unified voice of Spain, as the symbol of the country's legal, constitutional, and historical history.
Okay, so El Mundo there praising the king's speech, but I imagine that there was various opinions in the press.
Indeed. In the pro-independence paper Ara, there's an editorial by Monica Plans, who says that King Felipe is, quote, "the puppet of Mariano Rajoy." It says that the prime minister met with the monarch before the speech, and both the scenography and the actual speech itself are proof that the king is, quote, "the ventriloquist of the government." Now, in following with that train of thought, there's a cartoon this morning in El País that illustrates the point rather well. It's the fable of the scorpion and the frog by the cartoonist El Roto. It shows the frog, which represents the monarchy, and the scorpion, which represents the government, on its back. And the caption reads, "Take me to the other side. There I'll start a kingdom and make you minister." Now, of course, in the fable, both drown because the scorpion stings the frog. Moving on now to Vanguardia, on a more positive note, there's an editorial that says tolerance as gymnastics. It says that even if opinions are deeply divided over the referendum, that during the strikes and protests yesterday in Catalonia, that civicism prevailed among citizens. It says the region isn't broken, but it's simply divided, and that, quote, "sooner or later it will re-sow its seams."
Okay, quite a mixed bag of reviews there then on that issue. Moving on to another topic, across in the United States, we're still getting more details about this shooter and the events leading up to the attack in Las Vegas.
Yeah, in mass shootings, the press usually covers the killer, for at least at first. Well, now the stories of the victims are starting to come out. Let's just take a look at one of them. This is from The Independent. It's a long online article that covers nearly 30 pages. It's also in the actual paper. And the British paper tells us about some of these victims and who they were, with little touching details about their lives. It's a sort of a way of putting a human face to the tragedy.
Indeed, but as you were saying, a lot of media attention nonetheless on the killer and the arsenal of weapons he had stockpiled.
Yeah, this morning there are a lot of articles about the actual arms and the weapons that the killer used. The Los Angeles Times tells us that investigators found 23 guns in the hotel room, as well as 12 devices that make the rifles fire continuously, making them automatic rifles. They also found video cameras that told the killer when the SWAT teams were arriving. Okay. Now, the Times article also publishes video footage that originally surfaced in the German paper The Bild, and it shows, as you can see here, machine rifles on the crime scene, on the ground, and everything like that.
Shifting angles again, but sticking with roughly with that story, because since we saw that shooting, a lot of people posing the question of the definition of terrorism compared to mass shooting, compared to mass murder, and a lot of papers picking up on that.
Yeah, in the New Yorker on their website this morning, there's an article entitled "Why We Should Resist Calling the Las Vegas Shooting Terrorism." Masha Gessen argues that while it's still too early to tell what motivated the Las Vegas shooting, it's unlikely to have been politically inspired, which means she argues that it shouldn't be considered terrorism. She goes into the different definitions of terrorism, but says that basically you can create terror, but that doesn't mean it is actual terrorism. She calls calling Stephen Paddock a terrorist would elevate him to a combatant status, and that glorifies him. Gessen argues that Gasson argues that doing that helps us as spectators distance ourselves from the horror of what has happened, but that we shouldn't do that, the article argues, that we should accept that we are indeed all helpless when faced with a gun, be it from a terrorist or just a simple, normal, regular person.
Really interesting, the debate on the words we use when it comes to those attacks. Briefly, Solange, we saw over in the Middle East possible reconciliation between two opposing factions, Fatah and Hamas.
Yeah, even if many questions remain and tricky subjects need to be negotiated with Hamas, which is still in power in the Gaza Strip,
West Bank, yeah.
in the West Bank, yeah, and Fatah, El-Quds says that at the moment there is favorable regional and international climate for reconciliation. It argues that that's in large part to efforts by Egypt, and it goes into also other reasons why reconciliation has suddenly become a possibility. Now, Haaretz, the Israeli paper, says that reconciliation could be a good thing for Israel, even if the Israeli state has many reasons to oppose it. It says that an end to the environmental and humanitarian crisis in Gaza is in itself a positive thing.
Okay, so let's end that press review on a positive note then. Solange Moujon, thanks indeed for that.